morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our wrap up of the 2022-2023 admissions cycle. People are queuing in, so we're going to give a few minutes just for people to get settled and so that everybody doesn't miss anything. But thank you again for joining us. We're excited to share our observations of this year and also some tips for going forward based on what we've seen this past cycle. And we'll be starting shortly. We've got people still queuing into the room. A couple of questions already coming in. Some housekeeping items just before we get started. If you have any questions as we're going, please put them in the Q&A section and we'll be monitoring that as we go. And if we can't get to you, you'll have our contact information. You can always reach out later, but we will be monitoring it as we go. And we do have questions that everybody submitted before. We got a very large number of questions, which we appreciate. And that's what we based our structure on tonight, what you wanted to hear about. So if you asked a question in advance, you'll likely hear your answer as you tune in. So I think we're good now. Without further ado, Leslie, I'll pass it to you.
Terrific. I'm Leslie Singer of Brown Harris Stevens, and I will be moderating this evening. It's my pleasure to be working with Dr. Bari Norman, who is the co-founder and head counselor of Expert Admissions, as well as Sasha DeWind, who's the CEO of Tutor Associates. We do have some housekeeping. We tend to like to do a poll in the beginning to see who is in attendance. It's always helpful for us. And forgive me, I will be looking down because I do have a ton of questions to ask both Bari and Sasha this evening.
Yes, we're seeing where what ages we have represented in the audience so that we can gauge our answers and a little bit of our content accordingly. So we've got almost like exactly a little more than 50% 11th graders. Inching up a little bit from there, and then followed by 10th graders, and then 9th graders from there, and a small number of 12th graders and younger students who are also tuning in. So more than half 11th graders out there.
Great. So Bari, let's start with you. And can you please talk about the trends you saw in this past cycle in terms of application numbers and admit rates, and maybe we do an overview of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. So this year, for those of you who might not know, most the regular decisions basically come out by the end of March. So right now where we are, the early decision obviously wrapped up in December. There was an ED2 round at some schools. There was EA earlier, and then into regular decision. Between end of March and May 1st, students who receive an offer have the time to decide where they want to go. So the deadline to submit your response to an offer is May 1. So we're in this middle kind of middle ground right now where there may be some waitlist activity coming up, there may not be. Many colleges have released numbers and data, but not all of it and not everywhere. So we have been gathering lots of data as it's become available and happy to share some of what we've observed. So what I would say overall is that we've seen, for those of you who tuned into our Roundup after early, we got the question about what do you think is happening this cycle, or how is this cycle looking now compared to last year? At the time, I had said it seemed like, based on early, that things had kind of leveled out a bit, but we wouldn't know until this time. And it does appear, at least from our perspective with our students, that was the case. In terms of actual application numbers, we have seen mostly increases in application numbers and decreases in admit rates at the same time. But decreases in applications didn't necessarily mean large decreases in admit rates. So to give you some examples, places like Columbia, Duke, Boston College, Williams, Harvard, Cornell saw decreases in the overall number of applications this year. The admit rates didn't really shift all that much. Harvard went from 3.19 to 3.4, not a huge difference, obviously. Columbia's admit rate went from 3.73 to 3.9. It was still their third largest applicant pool in their history. So even though there have been some decreases and some good news in that regard, in terms of numbers, the admit rates aren't moving significantly, really. And then, of course, there are places that had their biggest years ever with double-digit increases or close to it. In the Ivy League alone, you had the largest applicant pools in the history for Yale, Penn, Dartmouth, Brown. Princeton doesn't announce any statistics. The others had slight decreases. So we're seeing, a little bit of leveling out. It's been sort of this upward climb for a while. So a little bit of sort of mixed news, but nonetheless, something that shows that perhaps that post-pandemic or onset of the pandemic is sort of leveling out a little bit. We are seeing more places that have sub 10% admit rates. So Amherst, Barnard, Colby, Bowdoin, Swarthmore, Vanderbilt, Rice, Northeastern, NYU, Hopkins, all sub 10%. And if you add 10% admit rates, the list gets even bigger. So we are seeing a trickle down effect in selectivity, where schools that used to be more reasonable for highly selective schools are getting at the sub 10% mark. That doesn't mean that just because it's sub 10% that they're all equally difficult to get into, remember, but nonetheless, the competition has increased. We're also seeing more schools with 100,000 applications and more. NYU with about 120,000, UCLA with about 146,000, Berkeley with about 126 for Berkeley, 145 for UCLA, Northeastern at about 96,000, and places like BU and USC with around 80-something thousand or 81,000. So more of these sort of ginormous applicant pools, which makes early decision even more important and early action when it's offered more important, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But that's just a quick roundup in terms of admit rates and application numbers, but we can dig a little bit deeper and talk about some other trends that we've noticed in the cycle in a little bit.
So you touched upon that we're in this unique time period, and for this year's seniors, and I know we only have a few of them, but in the past, have you seen waitlists move?
Waitlists are year to year, right? Like you can have a lot of activity one year at a school's waitlist and nothing the next year. They really have no bearing one year to the next. So don't look at last year's waitlist activity as an indication of what could or could not happen this year. It all is based on yield. So how many offers did they put out initially, and how many students actually took them up on it? Sometimes colleges are trying to go to the waitlist. They want waitlist activity because they don't want it to be so discouraging, and they don't want the waitlist to appear meaningless. Other places are just trying to do their best to hit their yield and aren't really necessarily trying to go, but if they have to go, they will. So there's the nuances of each school and what they're doing, but it always will just come down to that year's yield. So aside from the class of 2020, which was when the pandemic happened, smack in the middle of the application cycle, where there was a lot of waitlist activity, you really will see things year to year change drastically. So if you're on a wait list and you want to give it a try, I would say, listen, the most likely thing from a wait list is that it's going to turn into a deny, but there is wait list movement every year. And so go for it. Follow the instructions that the college gives you for follow-up. If they don't give specific instructions, then you have a little bit more freedom and flexibility to strategize on how you want to follow up, but don't let last year's numbers either encourage you or scare you.
Right. Sasha, from this past cycle, have you seen, we're moving over to testing a bit, have you seen as to like when students should start prepping? Was there any learning from this past year?
Well, I think, and we've discussed this on previous webinars, but we're in a largely test optional world now since COVID. Obviously, test optional was always a part of this equation at some of the smaller colleges and some of the other universities, but now it's largely it's sort of ubiquitous. And what test optional has meant is that children who are sending scores, you kind of create a little bubble. It's kind of a little bit mimics what Barry is talking about, right? As admits rates go down, the sort of competition gets hotter and students send higher and higher scores. So the biggest trend I've seen is that kids are sending higher and higher scores every year. And this year is no exception. We're seeing more students sending those 35s and 36s on the ACT and the equivalent on the SAT, and seeing students who aren't able to reach maybe those high scores really just not sending scores. So it's more that I'm seeing that students have higher expectations, understandably and correctly, for what kinds of scores will help their applications. In terms of when they start, I think that is just depends on the child, what their sports schedule looks like, how much time they need to get to those scores. Lots of kids are planning their sophomore year. That's a great time to plan. And some kids get started right away. Other kids get started over the summer before junior year. Others wait till the fall or even the spring. Some are even waiting things towards senior year. There's no right time to start. I do think 10th grade is the time to plan. And I certainly do see this sort of bubble at the top where the scores just keep getting higher and higher, because that's what test optional does to the landscape. It really insists that only good scores get sent. And then the good scores get higher and higher, which we know is good for colleges and universities and hard on our kiddos. So that's the trend I saw this year. And I think that will continue, although I will say there's nowhere else to go, right? You can't get higher than a 36. And so at some point the bubble's the top of the bubble and it stops there.
Yeah, and some data also for context there. So we have followed the mid 50 percentiles for SAT and ACT for pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. And you saw pretty reliably 100+ point increases in terms of the shift of where the middle 50% was for SAT. For ACT, 2 and 3 points, sometimes 1 point, but 2 and 3 points, not infrequently, which is a tremendous shift for those of you who know, on a 1 to 36 scale, when you're really generally, for a lot of these schools, up in the high 20s, maybe certainly in the low 30s. There's not that, like Sasha said, there's not really that much movement possible. And also, in some ways, so when you have a high score and then you shouldn't or don't want to send it, it feels crummy, right? Because you've got an objectively high score and then it's like unusable. The one thing that I will say is, while that does feel ick for sure, and I hate having to tell students who have a 1500 that they should really consider not sending it somewhere. It's absolute lunacy to say that out loud. One thing I encourage you to remember is that when it wasn't test optional, the schools for which that is the case, that 1500 would have been a lower score for those schools when you had to submit, when there wasn't the option. So you would have had to submit it, but at the most selective schools, it hasn't shifted all that much. I just think that the mid 50% that's published now is really more accurate to what you actually needed to get in if you weren't part of some special group that might be looked at, or there wasn't something super special about you that was going to stand out in some way where they might have had some flexibility. So I think in a lot of ways, what you're seeing now is just a little bit more truth to what the numbers really were all along, because you would hear us say here, and certainly one-on-one, don't look at the full mid 50%. We always were saying submit, you're stronger on the testing front if your scores, kind of neared towards the upper end of that range. Now the range unfortunately has narrowed, but in some ways, I think it just is a more truthful representation of what's a truly competitive score.
And I should say that the 1500 may not go to Harvard, but it may go to some of those schools. It may go to Barnard, right? Or it may go to another school. So those scores may, and that's where Bari really customizes that, but those scores may not be sent everywhere, and they still may help you in places that, 10 years ago might have been targets and are now harder and harder to get into. So there's also some flexibility in terms of where those scores are going and to whom.
Right. And like, I think it was Duke released early stats, right? Their mid 50% in their ED round was like 1520 to 1570. So if you had the 1500 and you were below the mid 50%, you really probably shouldn't send that, right? You're not in the mid 50%, let alone on the upper end. And as crazy as it sounds, because it's a fantastic score by any measure, you have the data now, I think, to guide you a little bit more honestly. Whether we agree with it or not is a whole other story. But as I always say, we don't make the rules. So
are there any statistics on those who didn't submit their test scores and how they fared? Or anything
it's very convenient that when the colleges give their initial data, barely, I think of all the ones we went through, they didn't include that statistic, Leslie. It may come out later. Duke also, again, they were really transparent. I applaud them for it. And after their early rounds, they had said 60% of their applicants in ED submitted scores, and 70% of their admitted students submitted scores, which I think is telling, certainly. Now, I can tell you from experience with our students, there absolutely are students who are getting in test optional, who would never have gotten in before with the scores that they had because they weren't where their grades were. There was a mismatch there. And there are students who are getting into highly selective schools without scores. At the same time, your chances are better. It is more predictable. Ideally, you want to give scores when you can. I also think that there is a difference for the Ivies. Going in without scores is different than going in without scores to other places. That's an individual conversation, but I can give you an example of a student who got into an Ivy League school without scores, but he's a true anomaly. It was very intentional. They're a rock star. The fit was fabulous. Like, we knew everything was going to come together. It was a worthwhile risk. I can give you no other example of it. So to come on here and say, yes, you can get in with that, it's not likely that it's going to happen, even though I can give you an example of it happening. So I think you have to kind of weigh you as an applicant at the particular school and see, what school is it? What kind of fit are you? And is everything else truly going to come together pretty perfectly that you would be one of those students, even in that uber competitive pool, that can get in without the scores? So yes, it's happening, but I would say I don't want to put false hope out there. And I also don't want to say to people, oh no, it's not really test optional. Both really are true at the same time.
I'm going to want to obviously spend some time on testing, but Bari, you've mentioned ED several times, and we have a lot of 11th graders joining us, and maybe it's a good time to actually really talk about what is ED, what is ED2, early action. If you want to, give some context to this year, terrific. But I think it might be a good time to just have a good explanation.
Yeah, we can do a quick overview. So early decision, which we call ED for short, you apply early, usually by November 1st or November 15th. You hear by mid-December. If the school admits you, you have to go. So you can only pick one school ED. There's EA, early action. You apply early, usually by November 1, November 15th. You hear anywhere from mid-December to late January, early February, depending on the school, but you are not obligated to attend, and you still get that May 1st deadline to tell them whether or not you're coming, that I mentioned at the top of the hour. So you can know on December 15th or in late January that you were admitted to a school, early action. They're holding your spot. You can see your regular decision notifications all the way through till the end, and then make a decision and end up going to that EA place in the end, or not. So it's binding versus not binding. There's an ED1 round, which is the November 1, November 15th deadline. More and more schools, although not a majority, certainly offer an ED2 round, a second round of early decision that usually coincides with the regular decision deadline of around January 1, and you hear by mid-February. It's also binding. If you get deferred or denied in the first round of early, you're released from your commitment and you can go into ED2 somewhere else and would be bound there. So that's a quick overview. Generally speaking, there is an advantage to apply, a statistical advantage to applying early, a strategic advantage. It's easier to get in, not easy by any stretch, but relative to the regular pool, if the fit is there and things are aligned, you have a better chance at making it in. So I like to say, if there's a place that you really like and you can get the deal done in early, that's what you want to do. You may or may not be able to, but in an ideal world, that's what happens. If you don't like a school enough to commit, don't apply there early, because you got to go if they take you. But in terms of trends for this year, so we're seeing, 50% of the class are coming in under an early decision. Hasn't been uncommon for a while. We're seeing more schools go above 50%. So it's at about 57% at places like BU and BC. It's above 60% at Barnard. There are a lot of places that are 50% and higher, filling the class, most of it, or at least half of it, from that smaller ED round. So that's one thing. One of the other things that we've seen is more denials at the outset. So particularly from some of the REA schools, the restrictive early action schools, both, Brown is an ED school, Yale is a restrictive early action school. Both happen to deny 67% of their early pools. That may sound harsh, but I applaud them for doing it. It gives people a real sense of where they stand. And you want to know, right? You want to know, should I potentially do ED2 or just at least get my mindset on somewhere else? If you had no chance going into regular, it's actually better for you strategically as the student to know that at the outset, even though it feels like a slap in the face. And we've also been seeing greater utilization of ED2 by both colleges and by students. I still would say that ED1 is the stronger pull, the greater strategic advantage, more people coming in ED1 versus ED2. There are some exceptions to that, but overall, as a general comment, I would say that that's the case. So those are some just numbers and trends from ED and EA.
Thank you. I'm going to take a step back again for some of the 11th graders and even our 10th graders. And Sasha, can you please give us an overview of the ACT versus the SAT? What are the similarities, the differences?
Sure, and this is a big year for change. So I can sort of give you the wrap up from this past year, and then I can talk a little bit to the current juniors and certainly the sophomores and the freshmen as well. There's been a trend that the ACT has become increasingly popular over the last decade. So that trend continues. And I've certainly seen more students taking the ACT than ever before in this past cycle. And that's with the old SAT, which I'll get into in a moment. And largely that's because there's just sort of choice now, right? 10, 15 years ago, these were sort of more regional traditions that didn't matter when you were actually applied, but certainly mattered from where you were applying. And now as children have choices, as I always like choices, I hope there are more choices for them, frankly. Many of them are choosing the ACT, which, I like to think of as like the more predictable, but maybe not so fun road. But I like predictable, and lots of parents like predictable, and kids do too. So from this past year, you see a sort of typically ACT leaning group of kids with plenty of SAT in there. And, overall, these are comparable tests, right? They're both testing a child's ability to do math with or without a calculator. We'll talk about that, to read and answer questions. There's some grammar tested. And, in that sense, they are comparable. And certainly when it comes to applying to Yale or Northeastern or Barnard, there's no preference between these tests. So historically and moving forward, it's really about picking the right test for your child. And that is dependent on so many variables. If I have to give the big overview, I think the ACT is a test that really doesn't give you a lot of time to do what it asks you to do. So most kids come out of it and say, oof, I didn't finish. And that's certainly a struggle. The ACT also has a separate science section. So they have a grammar section called English. They have a reading section, reading. They have a math section, and they have a science section. And I certainly know that my math science tutors find the math on the ACT more difficult in breadth and in difficulty. It just certainly covers more topics, and it is harder. And that science section is no one's favorite. Really, it's the last section on the ACT, and it is really scientific reading and interpretation. And, you know, just the stamina alone to do that science section at the end is a real deterrent for that test. Otherwise, it's a predictable test. It has continued to be predictable. In this coming year, we'll talk about how predictable it will be, but it is predictably difficult in certain ways, particularly when it comes to timing and when it comes to that science section and some of the sort of breadth of math topics covered. The SAT has always been and continues to be the less predictable of the two tests. You know, when kids come out of their SAT diagnostics, they say, I don't know how it went. I was between two answers on a lot of things. They all sounded right. They all sounded wrong. But certainly the math covered is more circumscribed. There is no individual science section, though there's some scientific reading. And there's a non-calculator section and a calculator section on this current SAT. We'll talk about the changes in a moment. So you can see as you dig in, they are different, even though they are comparable in the kinds of expectations and that they are multiple choice. But really up until now, and we'll talk about for our sophomores, it's really just been about your child taking a full SAT and a full ACT. It comes down to whether or not your child has accommodations, which we can certainly talk about. And it comes down to preference and skill, because there's no one right test. There's no one easier test. And each child has different, sometimes you take both and they are really the same. And sometimes one is just so much easier or so much more difficult. So in a typical year, it really is about just choosing which test you're taking. And I have plenty of juniors taking the SAT and plenty of juniors taking the ACT. And it comes down to their own strengths and preferences. Right now, things are changing. The
Next
SAT,
question.
yes. So the current SAT, the SAT as we know it, the one I just described, which is a paper test, just like the ACT, and has that calculator section and that non-calculator, all the stuff I just talked about. The time runs out on that. I think it's December 8th is the last Saturday that you can take an SAT. So certainly lots of our current seniors took it, and certainly many of our current juniors are taking that SAT. But come fall of this year, so fall 2023, if I can keep my years straight, there's a brand new PSAT. So for our current juniors, the PSAT will be brand new this fall. And then starting in March of next year, and this is for domestic students, international, I'm going to set aside. But starting in March of 2024, there's a brand new SAT, which the College Board loves to just have brand new SATs. They do this all the time. And it is significantly different. And, you know, the big picture differences are that it's digital. So it will be taken on a computer as opposed to on paper. It will be adaptive, which means how you do on the first module within a section determines the second module you're given, which is a lot like the GRE and GMAT, but is unprecedented for ACT and SAT. They're going to give you your calculator back for the whole thing. So they've done away with that no calculator portion. And it's shorter. So they're trying to go for things that they think kids will like. They think they'll like shorter tests, which sure, I like shorter tests, and they'll like having their calculator back. And they'll like digital. I'm not sure kids like adaptive, but it's certainly part of it. And you know, by and large, current sophomores, those ones who are just starting to think about this, some of them are going to take this old SAT, this current SAT, and get it done by December of their junior year. That happens for a handful of them. Some of them will prep for this new SAT that they can't even start taking until next March, which we can talk about. And I think this year, just like all the other years when the College Board has done this, most kids will just take the safe option, which is to take the ACT, which is remaining a paper test with the exact same sections and the same dates, and is not changing in the coming year, that we can talk about what's to come on the ACT. So, you know, again, ninth graders current parents who have ninth graders, you have a little time. The new SAT, you'll get a little time to figure this out. More practice materials will be released. And certainly current ninth graders will, again, have that choice between this new SAT and this old ACT. Current sophomores who are finishing up their 10th grade, they're going to lean heavily towards ACT with some important exceptions. And otherwise they'll stick with this old SAT or prepare for something very new next spring. And for those who do want to take the new SAT, there are materials, the College Board is releasing them, and there will be more and more. But you have less control over when you're taking it because it doesn't start until next March. You can't get going and you can't take it in the fall. And you'll be the guinea pigs, which, you know, isn't my preference, but certainly for some kids will be the right decision, and that becomes an individual choice.
Do you want to touch upon, do you anticipate that the ACT will go digital? I think a lot of people have that
Sure.
question.
Yeah, so it's so funny because the ACT is already digital internationally, which is so funny. It has been for a while. When you live abroad, you can't take a paper ACT. You can only take a digital one. And in the States, there are digital ACTs, but only given in certain states and at school. So the national test dates, if you're just a kid taking the ACT, you have to take it on paper now, but there's already a digital ACT out there and available, just only in certain places and in certain moments. So yes, if I had to predict it, there will be an option for more digital ACT testing in the future. They were going to kind of launch that, and then COVID hit, and they sort of backtracked on that, and they backtracked on a couple other things that they were going to launch. So do I think a digital ACT is coming sort of for national test dates? Yes, when they have not announced that yet. And there's no sign yet that test will be any different than the paper version. It will just be on a laptop or an iPad. But there's no suggestion yet that it will be adaptive or that it will change in content or quality. But yes, it's 2023, and I think we're headed towards a digital world in which all these tests will eventually be given on laptops. That's not happening this year. It's not happening next year for the ACT. And certainly there have been no announcements on that front, except for our international kids who have already started the new SAT. The new SAT has already launched internationally, and they've been taking the ACT digitally for years. So everything's a little different when you're abroad.
Great. Bari, can you talk about any of the top 20 colleges? Is there anything predictable in 2024 from what you've seen this year?
There's always predictable stuff, but there's also, this process is art and science. This process, like most things in life, has a sprinkle of luck as well, but luck is not a strategy. And so I think that yeah, of course, things are predictable. You can say the top 20, you can say the top 10, you can say the top 5 schools. There's always predictability to this process. The colleges are looking for specific things, each of them. Each student has something unique to offer that will appeal to some places and not others. We know that the essays are where you get to speak, and we know that the questions have been changing in very specific ways in recent years and have built into them a lot of assumptions and expectations. That gives you great control and ability on how to plan your extracurricular activities. It gives you a lot of control about how you present, how you engage with what you do and in what you do. And there's always the strategic piece, which is I'm qualified, I'm in the academic range for all of these schools, but where am I most likely to get in, right? Which of those schools are most likely to find me compelling? That's the funnest part of the process is finding those fits. I intentionally am not saying finding those matches, because it's actually not at all about match. Everybody matches somewhere. I'm interested in psychology. They have a psychology program with a professor doing research in psychology and classes in psychology, whatever it is. Matching is really like, basic level, like why you're even showing up. it gives them no reason to be compelled to pick you. And each of them, again, is looking for different, slightly different things, sometimes significantly different things. So there's absolutely predictability in the process. Don't let the numbers scare you. People are still getting in, trust me. So you have to know, again, where do you fall in the numbers? I love the numbers and I love the data and I share it because I know it's super helpful for people. And you do need the context, right? You don't want to have your head in the clouds thinking things are the same as they were. Forget about 30 years ago, maybe when the parents online tonight applied, but even 3 years ago, before the pandemic. So you need the numbers and the data to give you context. But the truth is, at the end of the day, I don't care about the data, right? Like, you need to know for you, what are your chances? So a school can have a 3.9% admit rate, but you may have a 75% chance of getting into that school versus a school with a 20% admit rate where your chances are more like, 5%. So who cares what the data says, right? You've got to know where you fit and where you're going to be most likely to connect. And so absolutely, don't let the numbers definitely are, again, they're not the most, they're not the most encouraging on the one hand, but at the same time, people are still getting in. And you have control over the process in many ways. We don't control the end result and the exact decision, but you have a tremendous amount of control about how you present yourself and what your potential options are and how to gauge which are those schools that ultimately make it on to what is ultimately a very short list relative to the options out there. So yeah, absolutely, there's predictability.
I think you answered this a bit in this last question, but one of the questions is, in this evolving admissions landscape shift, can you talk about crafting a school list? Like, what's the best way of crafting that list?
Yeah, so you still need, I don't use SAFE anymore. We used to say, reach, target, and safety, right? Or safe. Now we say safer. I think, there's always been a bit of the game playing with the safer schools on anybody's list, right? They can't take everybody who applies who are clearly using it as a backup. It's helpful for them to take some of those people because it, gives their numbers, brings their numbers up, their averages up. But they can't take everybody. And with more and more students applying and more students applying to more schools, it is less predictable on actually more on the lower end of your list than the mid and the upper end of your list. If your list is done well, if you're paying attention to fit, you're more likely to have the less predictability on the lower end. And so what you need to know is which are the schools that tend to play games more or less, right? So again, how safe is that, even though it should be. There's also your chances at a school depends what admission plans they offer and which one you're applying under. So your chances change in ED1 versus ED2, in EA versus ED, in EA versus regular, in ED versus regular. I mean, whatever they offer, you have different chances in each round. And so calling a school just generally safe or safer, you really can't do that. Plenty of places that would be quite safe if you did it early are going to be most likely a no in regular, which is why you've got to really play the more strategic chess game when crafting the list. So how do you do that? You still need the breadth. You need to understand that fit piece so that when you're picking places where you're in range, you're picking places where you're most likely to be, more compelling, assuming that you can get everything across in the essays the way they need to come across. And I'm speaking about the main essay, of course, but I'm really speaking about the supplements. Everybody talks about the college essay, and that is the one piece of writing you'll probably spend the most amount of time on, but you're going to spend more time than anything else on those supplements. And it's easy to get lazy on them and just to start recycling and, swapping out proper nouns. If you think that tailoring an essay means putting in a new professor's name, a new research project, a new class, and a new club, and you think that you're going to wow them by showing them how much research you've done, you've really done the bare minimum, which is go on the website and do a quick search. And again, you've said why you've shown up there, but you've given them no reason to select you. So when you're building your list, you have to be thinking about fit. When you're in 11th grade, 10th grade, or early 11th grade and 10th grade and younger, you grab schools together because they share certain characteristics that are important to you. When you start getting to the point where you're really an applicant, you need to switch it and say, how are these schools different from one another? And what are the ways, given that how they're different from one another, what are the ways in which I fit at each of these places very distinctly? And like, why do I have to study political science at Michigan versus UVA? Or why do I have to study biology at Cornell instead of Northwestern? Like, you need to know the answer to that question. And the answer isn't because this professor's here and that professor's there. So as you build your list, you need to be doing that deeper dive into the schools and have a better sense of what you have to offer, not just academic qualifications. About 80% of the pool is going to pass through that initial academic review. So get to know the schools well, get to know yourself well, learn kind of the ins and outs of the games they play or don't play, map out your strategy for ED, EA, ED2. You got to take into account when the notifications come out. You've got EA schools like Michigan, UVA, UNC. You're not going to hear about those until after you've got to put all your regular decision applications in. They also don't offer, UVA offers ED, but many of those flagship state schools, Texas, they don't offer any kind of ED. So if that's like your dream, or if that's kind of number two, if ED doesn't work out, you've got some tough choices to make about ED2 and what the rest of the list looks like. So there's a lot of moving pieces. But again, the more you know, the more control you have and the better the options will be in the end.
And strategically, Sasha, if one can take the SAT several times and submit the best scores from each section, why isn't that the recommendation for most? We're talking a lot of strategy on the application, but there's a lot of strategy that goes into the testing. And
Yeah,
please, the SAT too.
Yeah, without going into overwhelming people with terms, I know we're throwing out so much. I mean, there is something called super scoring, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about mixing and matching the best scores across different test dates. And historically, the SAT schools have traditionally, not always, it depends on the school, but they have traditionally super scored your SAT scores. And that means mixing and matching your best, reading, writing from one test and your best math from the other. I'll go into that in more depth in a moment. And the ACT is working hard to be just like the College Board. And in fact, they're pushing super scoring so hard that sometimes my kids are actually confused by their score reports, because their score report, when it comes back right in your face, is that super score from the ACT. They really want you to see it. And then you go, oh, wait, that wasn't my score from today. That was just all my scores together. So both the College Board and the ACT are very in favor of this idea of mixing and matching scores. And Bari can speak to this more, more than ever, schools are allowing you to self-report your scores, which really means that you are putting down the scores on the application, and there's nuance to what the ACT will do and the SAT will do on that. And then once you get in, you send your official scores. So in that sense, kids have mostly, and I don't want to overstate this, but they mostly have more control over what colleges see and the scores than they really ever have before, both because you need not send scores you don't want to send, because schools are test optional, and because many, though not all, will look at a super score, your best score across multiple dates. And again, there are exceptions, and the ACT on the Common App is still going to ask you to put your best composite to date, which is the average. So they're still going to see that. And the super score, it is a good strategy for many kids, and they're going to usually see everything. Depends again on if they allow self-reporting and what the schools are, but you certainly can't send scores that are, really amazing on one side one day and really weak on the other, and then flip it, right? You want, that's going to flag something for them. And so I like to think of super scoring as, it's a little bit like your ED2 kind of thing. Like, it's a thing we do at the end of this process. We will talk about it, and it will depend on where you're applying, and Bari can speak more to the application process, but a concise testing portfolio is ideal. You're not going to flag for the schools that there was ever a weak section. And there's a lot of strategy that goes into which scores to send. Now, when it comes to taking the test, a lot of times, which is certainly a great way to get a lot of scores that you can then play with later, it's all about opportunity cost for me. These are kids. They're busy, they're tired. We are in a test optional landscape. Grades are very important. Sleep is very important. Extracurriculars are very important. Their social lives are important too. And so I want kids taking tests when they're positioned to succeed. I don't want kids just taking tests for the sake of it. Yes, kids take it twice. Sometimes they take it 3 times, but it should be purposeful. It should be thoughtful, and we should be doing it when a child is confident and prepared. And then when all the scores are back at the end, that's when Bari comes in or I come in, and we can start playing around with what scores are going where, whether or not super score comes in, and that sort of whole self-reporting aspect of it, where the Common App asks for specific things and what our college is going to see.
Yeah, to clarify on the Common App, so now I would say a majority of schools allow you to self-report. So you don't have to send your full score report until the end as verification. But what you do have to do for the ACT is they ask for your best section score over your however many testing dates. You can put your best English, your best reading, your best math, your best science, and then it's your best single composite score. You are not reporting your super score or, your best super score. You are reporting your best single sitting composite. And then the college will do, if they're going to recalculate for a super score, they'll do it on their end. You also have some particularly highly selective schools, but it's not only, where they'll say, we don't super score, but we look at the best section scores from across test dates. Now that's a real non-answer or non-policy if you ever had one, right? So they're saying we're not going to recalculate a new composite for you, but we are going to look at your best section scores. So they are looking at both. The best advice I can give is, like Sasha said, a concise testing report. That's it. Go in and try to get it in a single sitting. Even if you could get a super score in 2 sittings, but in the 3rd sitting, you can hit it in 1 sitting, go in the 3rd time. It's just, it uncomplicates things. When you have a single section also that's very low and everything else is high and gives you a good super score. If that single section, math often, sometimes the science reasoning is maybe in the second place for that, but that can really impact outcomes for highly selective schools, and not only like the most selective. And so you really do want to try as best you can to do it efficiently.
We've touched upon scores, we've touched upon the application, but we really haven't spent a lot of time talking about grades and how they factor in, and do all grades count, including 9th grade, and we.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we can both answer this, but and again, we don't make the rules. And certainly, they understand that 9th graders are not 12th graders. And for certainly the most highly selective schools, I really do think the clock starts ticking the beginning of 9th grade. That transition to 9th grade is really important. And in a test optional landscape, in terms of what's going to get your application seriously looked at, there's nothing more important as a baseline than your grades and the rigor of your coursework. And Bari can speak to that more strategically, but you can always take an ACT later, pretty much. There's a lot of ACTs, there's a lot of SATs, and you can't retake your chem final, and you can't resubmit that lit paper. And so I always say grades come first. And then that's not to say the scores aren't important, as Bari's talked about with the statistics, but, having a child who is thriving academically is the baseline for all of this. And when a child is not, I always want to address that before we ever even think about anything else.
Looking at the landscape of this past year, are top colleges now looking for different traits or profiles in the candidates?
Yeah, I think one of the things that shifted is just institutional priorities, right? So they're interested in having more diversity of every possible kind. Like they want people from more high schools. They want people from just areas of the country that have been historically underrepresented or haven't really shown up. They want, just a range of people. To give you an example, Yale admitted 2,275 students this year. In that of that 2,275 students, 1,500 different high schools were represented, just to give you a sense. They really are looking to get like kind of just to mix it up a bit more. And so we are seeing some shifts in terms of, like I said, institutional priorities. Again, though, people are still getting in from the schools that were represented before, but it's getting tighter. So it just kind of the bar raises for what you need to submit and how you need to present. And really more than that, how you fit, right? Fit just becomes more and more and more important. The kids who are getting in aren't doing more than kids who are not. That's actually the truth of it. They're not doing more than you, and their grades are a little lower than kids who didn't get in. I can give you a million examples of kids who get in, and then if you look at grades and or scores, other kids who won't get in. It's because they don't fit. You may think you fit. You may be right that you fit, but you may not get that across in your essays. You may think you fit, but you really don't fit from admissions standpoint, from admissions perspective. So I think, again, it really comes back to knowing the individual schools well and knowing yourself, by the way. You've got to be able to kind of clear out, I want to go here, I liked the kids here. You keep that front of mind, for where you're looking at. But if you have to look at what your options are and then just be more intentional, because they're really looking for a wide range of kids. That's good news for everybody in a lot of ways, because it means that you don't have to fit into one, kind of little space. But we are definitely seeing that it's just getting tighter overall. Anybody who was part of this big pie before, your piece is smaller as it gets more diverse. And that's okay. Like, we know that's the case. And so, all right, we know that it's going to get a little tighter. Let's go in and give it our best shot, So I do think things are shifting and changing, but at the same time, we've always had this, right? They've always sought to bring in a diverse class. They've always been looking for different things. It's kind of more of the same, but certainly a shift.
And as for summer plans, are there, suggestions you might make for summer plans that would be most helpful for college applications? Did you see any trends?
Yeah, so we know that more than half of the people in our audience today are in 11th grade, so I'll speak mostly to that. This, what I would call 12th grade summer is really, really important because it's really where things wrap up before you start writing. It doesn't mean that nothing can happen or that you might not be able to incorporate some things that happen in the fall, but realistically, what happens really needs to tie up by the end of the summer. So that you can properly represent it in your applications, and you can have the experiences that are going to make you a better applicant and have more to say and give you a deeper vantage point and perspective. So it's really, really important what you do. That said, what you do, there's unlimited options. I would never say it's good or bad to do a program, although I do think the older you get, the less valuable programs tend to become, although there always will be certain programs for certain kids that make a whole lot of sense. People will sometimes say, should I work? Should I this? Should I that? Well, it depends what else you've done and haven't done. It depends what your focus is. It depends what you're going to get out of the experience. Just doing things, just checking boxes is going to, this process will ultimately disappoint you if you think that it's a checkbox kind of thing. I did this, I volunteered, I took the hardest classes, I got the grades, I got the scores, and I didn't get what I wanted. That's sort of, again, the baseline is really doing all of those things. If you look around you, who isn't doing those things? It doesn't mean you have to do big things. It doesn't mean you have to cure disease. It doesn't mean you have to create an enormous organization or raise a lot of money, but it does mean you need to actually think for yourself and think thoughtfully and intentionally about what you're doing, and not just do it, but reflect on it and take it and then apply it outside. So often people are so busy, I think, thinking like, what do they want? What should I do? That they miss the more obvious things that are going to make the bigger impact and be more interesting, quite frankly. So what anybody does with their summer it varies a lot. And what's really great for somebody's profile is going to be not particularly helpful for somebody else's. So it's really highly individualized, but I would say don't count anything out and don't assume that there's anything that's automatically a go.
And I'll also quickly say, and this is not about the application process, but the SAT or the ACT, whichever you pursue, it is kind of like a sixth class, right? It's a lot of work. And this is not true for all kids. Some kids are not even ready to think about it before junior year for various reasons, or they have very heavy fall sports. But the more you can get done when you're not taking 5 other courses, the better for me. I'm not a huge fan of stressed out juniors in the middle of exams, taking tests that they've just gotten familiar with. That can be right for certain kids. There's no rush. But I do think summer is a valuable time to push some of those things that are just hard to take on in the middle of junior year.
Oh, it's great advice.
I agree also in terms of the balance. One thing just to know, because people will ask this, is you can't put SAT prep as like one of your activities for the summer in the activities section. So when you do that, and it may be the best time to do it for sure, but just know that when you do it, that, it's not going anywhere. It's sort of like an invisible thing that you're doing, just like if you were doing it in the middle of the year and you still need to have some plans of some kind.
And that's
during the summer.
That speaks to the specificity of what this application is going to show, and the importance of the application will dig into how much you did these things, when you, and test prep aside, that's not going on any application, but they'll know if you did it for 1 week and, versus throughout all of high school, and that you plan to continue. There's a lot of information on that application, so they can really see the depth of the work you've done over time and the breadth of the things that you've pursued as well.
And always make sure to schedule rest time during the summer. I should have actually said that first when you asked Leslie. The goal is not to do a million things. The opposite, actually. How can you do anything substantive if you're all over the place? And you need to rest so that you can recover from the prior year, and so you can be ready to roar for the following year, particularly those juniors going into senior year with applications. So take some time to rest so you can do your best work. You don't want to be exhausted when you start, because you're going to fumble right at the most important point. So absolutely make sure, even if you have to literally schedule it, schedule in downtime for yourself, whatever that looks like.
Amazing advice.
I should do that too, Bari.
We should all do that.
Some downtime.
Note to self.
Note to self, yeah.
I'm sensitive we're getting short on time, and I know both of you are going to be incredibly, available to anyone and everyone afterwards. We've touched upon most of the questions in the Q&A. There was a general question of like, Bari, can you talk about what is actually fit for a student? And it might be a good way to wrap up and everyone to know that you're going to be available after this as well.
Yeah, fit is it's complicated. I think one of the most encouraging and also frustrating parts of this process is that there is no formula. Everybody's looking for kind of like the magic elixir, or the magic equation. If I do this and I do this, then I'm going to get in here. I'll get into a certain level of school, and it just doesn't work that way. And fit is much the same. It really is a mix of art and science. So you can say some very generic things. University of Chicago is a super intellectual place, right? It's a more creative, intellectual. Does that mean, just because you're creative and intellectual, or you can exhibit that you're getting in? No, right? And how do you do that even? And how do you, most people applying are going to, present that way. How, again, do you stand out? And it really is how people's personalities and stories and perspectives and like how they evolve, how it all comes together. And for us, at least, we really just paid close attention to who the different colleges tend to respond to, the kind of mix, those stories. It's like kind of saying, how do I write a good story, right? You can have a good story, but what goes into it? There's so many things, and it can look so different. And I think people often are kind of focusing on the wrong things, or things that aren't actually mattering so much. And I also think there's a tendency to lean on the generic even though people think that it's more tailored or that it's more specific. But you really have to remember just how large these pools are, and always think from the perspective of the people on the other side. If you were sitting there reading thousands of applications, do you realize just how many of them sound identical to one another, where the students are really indistinguishable? And so there isn't a sort of a magic thing or just sort of a list you could create and say, do this, do this, do this. I wish there were, because my job would be a lot easier. But it really is that kind of art and science. The thing that I would say for people is, dig more deeply into the places. Now, the way that a student culture might be and the way the vibe of a particular school doesn't mean that's how admissions fancies itself. But there's a lot of overlap there. And so it's a great place to start. Talk to current students, look up the newspaper online, go visit when you can. I really would encourage you to talk to people who are current students, as opposed to people like myself who graduated long ago. The colleges have changed quite a bit. It's not that it's bad to talk to people who went there a long time ago, but these places might as well be, different universes in many ways. And so the best thing to do is to get the most current information.
You guys are an amazing, amazing, amazing resource that I know will be available to everyone after this. And I cannot thank you enough for your time this evening. Do you feel like we didn't cover anything that we should as a last minute?
No, we're available for the specifics of your child, which, as you can tell, we're trying to give you the broad overview of what has happened and what is to come. But when it comes to your specific child, that's where you can talk to Bari and I individually. And Leslie, thank you so much for your curious and thoughtful question.
Always.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody for joining us and for sending in those questions too in advance. Have a great night.
Good night.
Good night.